The 2025 Formula One season was always going to be something of a transitional year in the sport. With major new regulations being introduced for 2026, there was a real reward for some teams who wanted to put all of their engineering effort into that car and putting this car's development slightly to one side. And you see that up and down the grid to greater and lesser extent. But the team that made the biggest and boldest change this year was Ferrari, a completely different car concept, a car concept that could only last 1 year by regulation, and a very bold choice to make that change. And how bold that change is, well, you really get to see that when you take a closer look at this year's Ferrari. And the most obvious change is the front suspension, switching from a pushrod front suspension system to a pull rod front suspension system is a fairly fundamental change, and one you normally wouldn't do in the final year of a set of technical regulations. But that's exactly what Ferrari have done, and that comes with a whole load of risk. Making the switch, we've talked about it a little bit before, it lowers a lot of the mechanical components in the steering system and in the suspension system, lower in the chassis. However, it also comes with serviceability problems. You can see the Ferrari mechanics working around here, and it's a bit harder to make adjustments to the suspension if it's all buried deep in the monocoque. It also has some aerodynamic benefits depending on who you listen to in the sport, but changing from a push rod to a pull rod is a very, very big change. But there are other big fundamental changes on the layout of this Ferrari. But looking at the front suspension that Ferrari used last year, we just have to take a look further down the pit lane at Haas. And here we see last year's Ferrari front suspension installed on this year's Haas because they share so many components. It's a really good comparison between the two cars. And there you can see the Ferrari layout employed very cleanly by the American team. But when you compare back to the Ferrari, you can see just how different that front end is. But the differences didn't stop there. The car was packed with lots of interesting aerodynamic details. Ferrari really had worked very hard on this year's car, and that work is continuing, and we're going to come to that shortly. But have a look here. I love this little detail of the mirror housing on the car, different for this year than to last year. And you can see that little winglet element just on the inner face of the rear view mirror. Now, Ferrari were the first team to really start experimenting with mirror housings and making them drag reducing, relating back to work done by the University of Miami some years ago. And Ferrari really pushed the regulations, the wording of the regulations, absolutely to the limit and continue to do so. But it's influenced all of the other mirror designs up and down the pit lane. And this is Ferrari's latest iteration of using the rear view mirrors as an aerodynamic element. Every team is doing it, but this is Ferrari's interpretation. They seem to like it. There are some other little details as well, which I absolutely love on this car. When you look from a wider angle, you start to see lots and lots of little details. It's, I think, just really open it up for me. You've got these little details. A lot of teams have got these now, just on the inner support of the rear view mirrors. Then you've got slightly modified versions of these aerodynamic elements alongside the halo. So far, no move towards Aston Martin style cooling ducts underneath this support section, but will they go that route in future? We'll have to wait and see. The roll hoop, pretty similar in concept to last season's car. No real reason to change that, even with a major change of car concept. However, working through the car, it does look like with the new car concept that Ferrari are using, they, like a number of other teams, including Mercedes, have taken some serious inspiration from Red Bull Racing. With this tight lower section, well, Ferrari always had that vertical slit on the lower part of the side pod duct, but previously it was separated from the main duct, but it's all integrated into one on this year's car. And just visible in this shot are some of the louvre cooling elements just ahead of the radiator, and they split up the cooling channel under the side pod in a lot of really interesting ways that they don't like us to take a close look at. And well, we'll do that later in the season. But when you look at the car from the side, you can start to see some of the other elements that they've been playing around with. You can see underneath the rear view mirror, taken inspiration perhaps from the 2022 Mercedes, with that large panel extending out ahead of the leading edge of the side pod. Not quite zero pods, but clearly the design inspiration coming from the 2022 Mercedes. You've also got these lovely little aerodynamic flick-ups on the end of that. I don't know if you can call it a side pod wing because it doesn't have a wing section, but it's quite an interesting piece of flow conditioning or aerodynamic wizardry, if you like. You can't really tell what all these parts do without sticking the car in the wind tunnel, and don't listen to anybody else who says different. But there are a lot of other changes going on. The cooling package on the car is constantly changing. Have a look at the cooling louvres on the rear bodywork here. This is the beginning of the season. Couple of slots there, couple of gashes, if you like, on the side. Then today in Bahrain, they've opened it up much more, and you can see 4 or 5 segments on the side. However, as the season has progressed, we've seen Ferrari playing with all sorts of different arrangements. We've touched on this before, with asymmetric arrangements, opening it up on one side, keeping it quite tight for aerodynamic reasons on the other, different components in the side pod being cooled differently. And then you can see it again, they're changing it to 2 tight versions. This was again earlier in the season, 2 tight little coolers. I think that's in the last day of pre-season testing again in Bahrain. So quite an interesting comparison between a high temperature Bahrain this weekend and a low temperature Bahrain in testing. And temperature is a big factor. So while Ferrari's results on track haven't necessarily been the best, yeah, there was a good result for Lewis Hamilton in the sprint in China. He was later disqualified from the main Grand Prix for excessive wear to the underfloor plank. Here you can see in free practice 1 here in Bahrain, the mechanics changing the plank on the other team car. That's just this section. And what's interesting about this bit of footage is you could just see there how the plank is separated into different segments. So you have the forward segment that you can see just here in the mechanic's hands, but then you can also see the middle segment here. There's also a rear segment to this plank, and it was the rear segment that was found to be excessively worn on Lewis Hamilton's car. And that's really odd, because normally the cars wear this front segment much harder than the rear segment, and that has sparked quite a few rumours for Ferrari. Some people are saying, and they've been saying all season long, that one of the big issues with the Ferrari is that its new gearbox that they started the season with isn't stiff enough. The casing of the gearbox is flexing somehow and isn't giving the rigidity at the rear of the car that the car really needs to react. I'm not sure I really subscribe to that theory. There's various simulation tools Ferrari will have had long before they sort of cast any metal parts or manufactured any carbon fibre parts to manufacture that gearbox casing that would have prevented that. So that seems a little bit unlikely. The other theory I've heard is also that the rear suspension system lacks quite a lot of stiffness. Again, not convinced by that. Haven't seen anything that confirms that. The team has kind of quietly said that's not really the case. And I think really that that's just a little bit of fantasy and myth making by some people in the paddock who don't quite know what's really the issue is with Ferrari. One issue that we do know, though, that does relate to this section of the car is Ferrari cannot run the floor, or could not run the floor, as low to the ground as they really wanted to. And that has been confirmed by the drivers on more than one occasion. Now, these changes to the floor meant the car had to sit slightly higher at the rear, and there are some people who suggest that Ferrari's rear end sits slightly higher to the surface of the racetrack, a higher rear ride height than a number of other teams. And perhaps to address this, at least in part, for the Bahrain Grand Prix, Ferrari has introduced a completely new floor to the car. And we can take a look at that floor just here, because some of the details are quite apparent. The real secret bits underneath the center of the floor, we're probably not going to be able to show you. However, some of the more evident bits on the outer edges of the floor, we can show you. So you can see actually quite clearly here, the new panel leading edge of the floor where you've got this sponsor's logo. You can actually see the different color material where they've grafted that onto existing components. But what I can say is there are changes along this section of the floor. The shape has been revised ever so slightly, and this stepped element along the floor edge, that's all new as well. Similar in concept to the old floor, but a different shape, and different shapes are all that matter. You can also see that there's some change being done around this central element of the leading edge of the floor as well. So a bit of work going on there. That absolutely tells you there's more stuff, quite exciting stuff that's going on underneath the floor, but it doesn't stop there. As you move further rearward along the floor, this is the new specification used by Lewis Hamilton in free practice 1. His temporary teammate for free practice 1 used the old floor, which we're going to take a look at in a minute, but Hamilton had this for exclusive use initially, and then Ferrari swapped the floors, then both cars were running the same specification. Charles Leclerc will have that new spec floor for the rest of the weekend as well. When you look further back along the side of the floor as well, you can see more changes. I like to call this section of the floor the viaduct wing, because it looks a bit like some railway architecture on some cars, but I think the FIA have referred to it as a floor edge wing. It's not a wing, so I don't think that's a correct title. However, look at these sections along the edge, lateral protrusions that sort of stick out. Don't know what you'd call those, but it's got 3 of these sculpting elements along the side, and they're very beautifully detailed. In fact, I think we should take a closer look at this central one, for example, and you can just see it's not just a simple bit that sticks out that's a straight panel. It's very curved, very sculpted. A lot of work in the wind tunnel, a lot of work in CFD, and you think you're making that at 60% scale for the wind tunnel, that's going to be some really fine, real craftsmanship going on in developing these cars. But when you compare this shape along the floor edge wing, as the FIA refer to it, you can see 3 sections here. Compare it to the old specification car that made a brief appearance in Free Practice 1 on the other Ferrari, and you can see this section of the car much shorter to start with, and only 2 protruding elements. Again, a strong indication that there's more going on underneath the car. But for me, the really exciting thing was actually further back. Yes, the floor is likely to make a big difference and allow Ferrari perhaps to run a slightly lower ride height, or perhaps this floor is better at running at the ride height that they've been given with this setup. But for me, the really exciting thing, and only just because it's a bit different to everybody else and what they're using, can be seen just down here, poking out just alongside the exhaust. It's a little winglet that's attached to the what some teams call the Y-Lon, the rear wing support, because it's Y-shaped and it's a pylon, so Y-Lon. Manor Motorsport came up with that one. Here you see it from a slightly better angle, and you can see this new winglet that they've attached to the back of the car. 2-element winglet with an end plate. It's pretty clear here. There you go. You can see that central slit. You can see there, 2-element winglet. But do you see what's wrong with this picture? I'll take the telestration off in a second. It's mounted backwards. So normally if you expect a downforce generating component to look like that, you'd expect this to be the front and the airflow to be coming at it this way and flowing up over it, generating downforce. But it's the other way round. So it's clear Ferrari have discovered some way of, or developed some way of bringing the airflow up from somewhere down here over the rear suspension elements, and this new aerodynamic element is clearly doing some, well, something beneficial to the rear end of the car. Ferrari are being a bit vague in their terminology about what it really does. I think it's really interesting. No team has actually developed this area of the car in this way so far. So it'll be interesting to see if any other teams use up some of their very scarce aerodynamic testing budget to develop their own versions of this, or is Ferrari going to have exclusivity on this concept for the rest of the season? Bit of a bold move. Again, Ferrari working hard on this year's car, clearly not putting everything into next year's car yet. Will they change that? Depends, I think, how the rest of the season goes on. Now, I was talking about some of the clever stuff happening underneath the floor. Well, here we can take a look underneath the floor. Just from the rear end, we don't normally get to look under the diffuser, but there's a few interesting details on this shot that I'd like to show you. You see these little numbers dotted around underneath the floor. These will relate to pressure tappings in the floor. There'll be little sensors in the floor that Ferrari will be using to see how the air is flowing under this new, significantly revised diffuser setup. And this car is, as I circled there, number 44. This is Lewis Hamilton's new floor. So you can see the shape of the overall diffuser on the outer element, but the real trick to it is all of this sculpting that's going on inside, under the floor, around the gearbox, all of this stuff that's quite hard to pick out in this picture. It looks like an angry cartoon I've just drawn there, doesn't it? But when you compare this floor layout to the old specification floor here in the Ferrari garage, you can see also Ferrari were doing a like-for-like comparison. There again are the same pressure tappings in the floor, but I think you can see a bit more sculpting on the floor around the gearbox and a few different shapes around the edge. A little bit hard to compare, especially when it's so dark and the team don't want us to take too close a look. Now, in free practice in Bahrain, it wasn't really conclusive. Free practice 1 was very, very hot compared to pre-season testing and compared to the competitive sessions we're going to see in qualifying and into the Grand Prix. So while the Ferraris didn't look particularly competitive, I don't think it's representative of what will happen as the weekend goes on. Also, with such a major aerodynamic change to the car, it may take 1, 2, 3 races before we really find out what's going on with this new aerodynamic package, because you change something as fundamental as that, it's going to change your setup window, it's going to change how your car performs, it's going to change how the tyres wear even, because the aero balance is going to be slightly different front to rear. So a lot more to come from Ferrari, but what Ferrari are probably truly hoping is that the view that this new floor is going to give every other team on the grid is this one, straight up the exhaust pipe as the Ferraris disappear off into the distance. Ferrari fans will be hopeful, Lewis Hamilton will be hopeful, as will Charles Leclerc. Will it actually work out? Well, I wouldn't bank too much on the result of the Bahrain Grand Prix. I think there's an awful lot more to find in terms of pace and aerodynamic performance from this Ferrari. Will this new floor have cracked the problem? Not sure yet.